The blizzard had been howling for 6 days when Hezekiah Tate knocked on Ephraim Gage's door, his arms loaded with frozen wood, desperation carved into his frost-burned face. Inside, Ephraim sat calmly beside a rectangular pit in his cabin floor where flames still danced over logs he had placed there 19 days earlier, untouched, unreplenished, burning as steadily as the day he lit them. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The winter of 1848 brought storms to the Dakota Territory that old trappers still spoke about decades later. Snow fell in waves that buried cabins to their roof lines. Temperatures dropped so low that spit froze before hitting the ground. Men died in their sleep when fires went out, and cold crept through log walls like an invisible predator. Survival meant constant vigilance, endless wood gathering, and fires that demanded feeding every few hours, or they would abandon you to the frost. Ephraim Gage sat on the dirt floor of his cabin, watching flames flicker in the rectangular pit he had dug into the earth. The pit measured roughly 5 feet long and 4 feet wide, its stone-lined walls descending more than 2 feet below floor level. Inside, 30 logs were arranged in careful layers, some standing vertically along the edges, others lying horizontal across the center. Red coals glowed at the bottom where the fire burned slowly, methodically, consuming wood at a pace that seemed to defy the laws of combustion. It was day 19 since he had lit the initial load. 19 days without adding a single piece of wood. The cabin stayed warm enough that frost never formed on the interior walls. Ephraim wore only a single layer of wool, comfortable, almost lazy in his movements. Outside, the blizzard screamed and clawed at his door, but inside, the sunken pit radiated steady heat that seemed to rise from the earth itself. 300 yards away, Hezekiah Tate was burning through wood like a man possessed. Every 2 hours his fire demanded more fuel. Every trip outside to his woodpile meant exposure to wind that could kill in minutes. He had started the storm with what he thought was adequate supply. 6 days in, he was rationing, stretching each log, watching his pile shrink with growing panic. When Hezekiah finally broke through the snowdrifts to Ephraim's door on the morning of the 6th day, he carried an armload of frozen wood and a question he did not want to ask. Ephraim opened the door and stepped aside. Hezekiah entered, shaking snow from his coat, and stopped. The cabin was warm, genuinely warm. His eyes found the pit in the floor, saw the flames still burning over logs that looked barely diminished from when he had last mocked this insane design 3 weeks earlier. Ephraim said nothing. He simply gestured toward the pit and returned to his seat on the floor. Hezekiah stared into that rectangular hole, watching fire burn in a way that should not be possible, and understood that everything he knew about frontier survival had just been proven inadequate. The impossible was burning quietly in a stone-lined pit, and it had been burning for 19 days. Spring came late to the Dakota Territory in 1847. Snow still crusted the ground in shaded hollows when Ephraim Gage and Silas Drummond set their trap lines along the tributaries feeding the James River. They had partnered that season after meeting at Cyrus Wendell's trading post, 2 men with similar temperaments who preferred silence over conversation and competence over companionship. Their cabin sat in a valley sheltered by pine ridges on 3 sides. They had built it in 4 days using standard construction methods: logs notched at corners, mud chinked between gaps, a simple door hung on leather hinges, and a basic stone fireplace that drew adequately when the wind cooperated. It was sufficient for 2 men who spent most daylight hours working trap lines and needed shelter only for sleeping and processing pelts. The morning of April 12th started unremarkably. Ephraim left before dawn to check the northern line, while Silas stayed to process beaver pelts from the previous day's haul. The fireplace held a modest blaze, enough to keep the cabin warm and provide light for close work. Silas said he would maintain it and check the southern traps in the afternoon. Ephraim worked his line methodically, pulling 6 beavers from traps and resetting mechanisms for the next cycle. The work took longer than anticipated. A trap had been disturbed by something, possibly a bear, emerging from winter denning, and he spent extra time relocating it to a more secure position. When he finished, the sun was already dropping toward the western ridges. He returned to camp as twilight faded to darkness, carrying his catch and anticipating hot coffee and whatever dried meat Silas had prepared. The cabin was dark. No smoke rose from the chimney. Ephraim felt cold touch his chest that had nothing to do with temperature. The fire had gone out. He could not determine exactly when or why. Perhaps Silas had let it burn too low before leaving for the southern line. Perhaps wind had shifted and backdrafted smoke until flames suffocated. Perhaps he had simply misjudged the wood supply. The reason did not matter. Silas Drummond sat against the far wall where he had apparently tried to restart the fire using flint and steel. The tools lay near his stiffened hands. He had gotten close. Char marks on kindling showed he had struck sparks, had nearly succeeded, but nearly meant nothing when temperature dropped and exhaustion took hold. He had frozen slowly, alone, while Ephraim checked traps 6 miles away. Ephraim buried his partner on the hillside above the creek 2 days later. He marked the grave with stones and spent that night in the cabin, unable to sleep, staring at the fireplace that had failed its most basic function. Silas had not died from bear attack or accident or illness. He had died because fire, the most fundamental tool of human survival, demanded constant attention and forgave no lapses. That night, Ephraim Gage began thinking about holes in the ground. Ephraim finished the trapping season alone. He worked his lines mechanically, processing pelts without joy or purpose beyond completing what he and Silas had started. Every evening he returned to the cabin and built the fire larger than necessary, feeding it compulsively, waking twice each night to add wood he did not need. The fireplace had killed his partner through simple physics and human limitation. He could not forgive it. In June, he traveled to Cyrus Wendell's trading post to sell the season's furs. The price was fair. Ephraim took his payment and spent 3 days in the settlement doing something other trappers found strange. He visited every cabin within walking distance and studied their fireplaces and heating systems. He asked questions about wood consumption, how long fires lasted unattended, how often men woke during winter nights to feed flames. The answers formed a consistent pattern. A standard fireplace consumed 12 to 15 logs during a cold night. It required tending every 2 to 4 hours to maintain adequate heat. Leave it unattended longer than that, and you risked waking to frozen water buckets and frost on interior walls. Leave it much longer, and you risked not waking at all. Ephraim met an older Norwegian trapper named Alistair McBain, who had spent 3 winters in a sod house on the plains. Alistair described how earth itself held warmth, how dugout shelters stayed warmer than log cabins because soil insulated and retained heat that wood could not. He explained thermal mass, though he did not use that term. He simply said that dirt remembered warmth and gave it back slowly. This conversation planted something in Ephraim's mind. Fire needed fuel and oxygen. Standard fireplaces provided abundant oxygen, causing wood to burn hot and fast. What if you limited oxygen? What if you surrounded fire with material that absorbed heat instead of letting it escape? What if you built a fire that sipped fuel instead of devouring it? He returned to the mountains in July with notebooks he had purchased at the trading post. He was not an educated man, but he could sketch and take measurements. He began visiting abandoned cabins scattered through the territory, examining how different fireplace designs failed. He found cabins where fireboxes had cracked from thermal stress. He saw chimneys that drew too well, creating fires that consumed wood wastefully. He discovered fireplaces built so poorly they barely drew at all, filling cabins with smoke. Every failure taught him something. Sharp corners cracked under heat cycles. Wide fireboxes with good airflow burned clean, but consumed fuel rapidly. Narrow. Designs conserved fuel, but created smoke problems. He needed something different entirely, not a fireplace built upward and outward, but something built downward and inward. A fire that lived below instead of above, insulated by earth, fed by controlled air, burning so slowly that days could pass between feedings. By August, Ephraim knew what he needed to build. The design existed only in his notebooks, but it was complete. Ephraim returned to his territory in late August of 1847 and selected a new cabin site on higher ground half a mile from where Silas had died. He wanted no memories contaminating his focus. The location offered good drainage, sight lines in 3 directions, and soil composition that would allow deep excavation without hitting bedrock or excessive clay. He built the cabin walls first using standard methods, working alone, completing the structure in 10 days. Other trappers passing through saw nothing unusual. A solitary man building a winter shelter was common enough. Some stopped to help raise roof logs. Others shared coffee and moved on. Ephraim accepted assistance without explaining his plans. When the cabin walls stood complete and the roof was sealed, Ephraim began digging. He marked a rectangle on the dirt floor measuring 5 feet by 4 feet, positioned near the center of the structure where weight distribution would not compromise wall integrity. Then he started removing earth. Hezekiah Tate arrived on the 3rd day of excavation and stood in the doorway watching Ephraim shovel dirt from a hole that was already 2 feet deep. Hezekiah was a thick-shouldered man from Pennsylvania who had been trapping the territory for 6 years. He considered himself knowledgeable about frontier construction and survival. He asked what in God's name Ephraim was doing. Ephraim replied that he was building a fireplace. Hezekiah looked at the rectangular pit, looked at the perfectly good cabin wall where a normal fireplace should be built, and laughed. He said it looked like Ephraim was digging a grave in his floor. He asked if Ephraim planned to bury his common sense there. Ephraim continued digging without responding. Hezekiah watched for several minutes, shook his head, and left. Within a week, every trapper within 20 miles had heard about the madman digging a hole in his cabin floor instead of building a proper fireplace. They came to see for themselves. Some offered genuine concern, suggesting Ephraim might be touched by grief over his partner's death. Others mocked openly, calling it the stupidest waste of effort they had witnessed. A trapper named Barnabas Cole asked practical questions. Where would smoke go? How would Ephraim cook? What stopped the pit from filling with rainwater? Ephraim answered patiently. Smoke would rise through ventilation gaps he had built into the roof design. He would cook over the pit using an iron grate. Rain would not penetrate because the roof was properly sealed, and the pit would remain warm enough to evaporate minor moisture. These answers satisfied no one. The consensus among the trapping community was clear. Ephraim Gage had lost his mind to grief and was building something that would either kill him through smoke or force him to abandon the cabin and build properly before winter. Hezekiah started a betting pool on how many days into cold weather before Ephraim gave up and begged for help building a real fireplace. Ephraim ignored them all and started lining his pit with stones. The creek bed 300 yards from Ephraim's cabin provided everything he needed. Centuries of water flow had tumbled and smoothed river stones into shapes that fit together with minimal gaps. He spent 4 days selecting stones, rejecting any with cracks or crystalline structures that might fracture under thermal stress. He wanted dense, fine-grained river rock that would absorb and radiate heat without failing. Hauling stones from creek to cabin consumed another week. Each stone weighed between 10 and 30 pounds. He needed enough to line 4 walls descending more than 2 feet into earth. He made dozens of trips, building a pile outside his door, sorting by size and shape, planning the layout before placing a single stone. The pit floor came first. He dug down to 2 feet 6 inches, then laid flat stones across the bottom, fitting them together like puzzle pieces. No mortar, just careful selection and placement. The floor needed to support weight of burning wood and resist cracking from heat cycles. He chose the flattest, most stable stones for this foundation. The walls required different thinking. Ephraim started at the bottom and worked upward, setting each stone so it tilted slightly inward. This created compression strength as upper stones pressed down on lower ones. He paid special attention to corners, rounding them deliberately rather than creating sharp angles. He had seen too many fireplaces crack at corners where thermal expansion had nowhere to go. Curved transitions distributed stress evenly. Alistair McBain stopped by during the second week of stonework. The old Norwegian studied the pit without speaking for several minutes, then nodded slowly. He told Ephraim that earth houses in the old country used similar principles. Soil and stone together created what he called thermal mass. They absorbed heat during the day and released it through the night, moderating temperature swings that would otherwise kill crops or freeze livestock. Alistair explained that Ephraim's pit would function like a heat battery. Stone would absorb warmth from fire and radiate it long after active flames diminished. Surrounding earth would insulate this heat, preventing it from dissipating into ground or air. The combination meant fire could burn with less intensity while maintaining warmth, because the pit itself became a secondary heat source. This confirmation of Ephraim's instincts felt like vindication, but he shared it with no one. Alistair moved on toward his own winter grounds, and Ephraim continued placing stones. The final rows required precise work. He needed the stone lining to reach exactly flush with floor level. Too low, and dirt would crumble into the pit. Too high, and it would create a rim people could trip over in darkness. He spent 3 days on the top course alone, selecting and reshaping stones until they met the dirt floor seamlessly. When finished, the pit looked almost natural, as if earth had always contained this stone-lined chamber. The rounded corners caught firelight in ways sharp angles never could. Ephraim ran his hands along the stones, feeling their solidity, and began planning the fuel load. Ephraim spent the first week of October cutting wood with obsessive precision. He rejected the standard practice of splitting whatever dead timber was convenient. Instead, he walked the surrounding forest, identifying specific trees, studying grain structure and density, selecting wood that would burn slowly and produce maximum heat with minimum flame. He wanted hardwood primarily, oak when he could find it, ash and maple as alternatives. He avoided pine and spruce except for kindling. Softwoods burned too quickly, their resinous nature creating hot flames that consumed fuel wastefully. Hardwood burned slower, producing sustained coals that could maintain temperature for hours. Each log was split to similar dimensions, roughly 6 inches in diameter, 18 inches long, shaped consistently so they would stack without excessive gaps. This uniformity mattered because his loading theory required precise arrangement. Random wood piles burned chaotically. Organized fuel loads burned predictably. He calculated capacity. The pit measured 5 feet by 4 feet at floor level, tapering slightly toward the 2-foot 6-inch depth. Volume approached 40 cubic feet. A standard log measured approximately 1/2 cubic foot. He could fit 70 to 80 logs if he stacked carelessly. But careful arrangement allowed for 35 logs positioned to maximize both fuel density and airflow control. The stacking pattern emerged through experimentation. He placed the first layer of logs vertically around the pit perimeter, butted against the stone walls. These created a wooden liner inside the stone liner, positioned to burn last. They would also reflect heat inward and restrict oxygen flow from the sides. The second layer went horizontally across the bottom, resting on the stone floor. 6 logs laid parallel, touching but not compressed. These would burn first, creating the coal bed that would sustain combustion. Third layer returned to vertical placement, but positioned 1 log width inward from the perimeter. This created a nested cylinder of wood with the coal bed at its core. He continued alternating horizontal and vertical layers, each positioned slightly inward from the previous, creating a structure that resembled a wooden dome or inverted cone. The center, remained open down to the horizontal base logs, creating a chimney effect within the fuel load itself. The physics seemed sound. Limited oxygen would enter from the top opening. Heat would rise through the central channel, igniting the horizontal base logs slowly. As those burned to coals, surrounding vertical logs would topple inward gradually, feeding the fire at a controlled rate. The stone walls would absorb heat from outer logs and radiate it back, maintaining combustion temperature even as active flame reduced to smoldering coals. On October 15th, Ephraim loaded his pit for the first time. 35 logs arranged exactly as planned. The wood represented roughly 1 week of fuel consumption for a standard fireplace burning continuously. If his theory worked, this load would burn for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. If his theory failed, he would become the territory's most mocked trapper and face winter with inadequate heating. Hezekiah's betting pool had reached 17 participants. October 16th dawned cold and clear. Ephraim woke before sunrise and prepared kindling from dry pine splits and birch bark. He arranged the ignition materials carefully at the center of his fuel load, positioned atop the horizontal base logs where the coal bed would eventually form. This first lighting carried significance beyond simple fire starting. It would validate or destroy months of theory and labor. Word had spread that Ephraim planned to light his pit that morning. By mid-morning, 7 trappers had gathered outside his cabin, ostensibly passing through, but clearly waiting to witness the failure. Hezekiah Tate stood among them, arms crossed, wearing an expression of amused anticipation. Barnabas Cole attended with genuine curiosity rather than mockery, asking technical questions Ephraim answered briefly. Ephraim struck flint to steel at 10:30. Sparks caught the birch bark immediately. Small flames spread to pine kindling, growing stronger, reaching upward through the vertical logs toward the cabin roof. Smoke rose steadily through the ventilation gaps Ephraim had built between roof logs. The draw was adequate, not perfect, but sufficient to prevent interior smoke accumulation. The gathered trappers watched flames climb higher, consuming kindling rapidly, beginning to char the horizontal base logs. Hezekiah muttered that any fool could start a fire. The test would come in how long it lasted and whether the cabin burned down in the process. Ephraim said nothing. He had built a simple iron grate that spanned the pit opening, positioned 6 inches above floor level and removable for adding fuel if his theory failed. He placed a coffee pot on this grate, demonstrating the cooking functionality Barnabas had questioned. Water boiled within 15 minutes. By noon, the initial kindling flames had settled into a different burn pattern. The fire no longer reached dramatically toward the roof. Instead, it concentrated at the pit's center, glowing intensely where horizontal logs were converting to coals. The vertical logs surrounding this core showed char marks, but were not actively burning. Heat radiated from the stone walls noticeably. Standing 3 feet from the pit, Ephraim could feel warmth on his face and hands. The spectators gradually departed. There was nothing dramatic to witness. The pit simply burned steadily, unremarkably, producing heat without spectacle. Hezekiah left last, commenting that anyone could maintain a fire for a few hours. The real test would come when Ephraim had to leave for trap lines and the fire sat unattended. Day 2 brought the first genuine test. Ephraim left at dawn to check his northern traps, deliberately staying away for 12 hours. When he returned at dusk, the cabin was warm. The pit still glowed with active coals. The vertical logs had burned down approximately 3 inches, toppling inward gradually as he had predicted, feeding the central coal bed without smothering it. Day 3, Day 4, Day 5. The fire continued burning. Ephraim added nothing. The fuel load sustained itself through controlled combustion and thermal mass principles that transformed theory into heat. By Day 7, trappers stopped making jokes. Day 12 arrived with a sky the color of old iron. Ephraim recognized the signs immediately. Barometric pressure dropping, wind shifting to northwest, temperature falling rapidly despite midday sun. A major storm system was building, the kind that could last a week and kill anyone caught unprepared. He spent the afternoon securing his cabin, sealing ventilation gaps to minimum necessary airflow, stacking additional firewood inside against the wall, even though his pit still burned steadily with half its original fuel load remaining. The storm hit that evening with violence that shook the cabin walls. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to arm's length. Wind drove ice crystals through microscopic gaps in the log chinking, creating tiny drifts on the interior floor along the walls. Temperature outside plummeted to levels where exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Ephraim sat beside his pit, watching flames dance over logs that had been burning for 12 days. The storm howling outside made leaving impossible. Even walking 300 yards to check on Hezekiah's cabin would risk death. He was trapped inside with whatever resources the cabin contained. For most trappers, this situation meant constant fire tending, burning through wood reserves rapidly, hoping supplies lasted until the storm broke. Ephraim's pit required nothing. He cooked his meals over the grate. He melted snow for drinking water in his coffee pot. He maintained comfortable temperature wearing a single wool shirt. The stone-lined chamber radiated heat so steadily that frost never formed on the interior walls despite brutal cold penetrating the log structure. Day 13, day 14. The storm continued without pause. Snow accumulated to depths that buried the cabin's lower logs. Ephraim could hear wind tearing at the roof, testing his construction, seeking weakness. Inside, the pit burned on. The remaining vertical logs had collapsed inward, creating a dense coal bed that glowed red when he looked down into the stone-lined chamber. Minimal flame, maximum heat. Exactly as designed. Day 15 brought a brief lull. Ephraim opened his door against shoulder-high snow and carved steps down to ground level. He could see smoke rising from Hezekiah's cabin 400 yards distant. The smoke came in irregular pulses, indicating someone frantically feeding a fire that demanded constant attention. Ephraim's own ventilation gaps released barely visible heat shimmer. His fire had achieved equilibrium, burning so efficiently that smoke production was minimal. The storm resumed that afternoon with renewed intensity. Day 16, day 17. Ephraim worked on equipment repairs, sewed torn clothing, occupied himself with tasks that were impossible when running trap lines. The pit demanded nothing. He had not added wood since October 16th. 12 days had become 17, and the fuel load still sustained combustion. Day 18 brought another lull. Ephraim climbed out again and saw Hezekiah Tate struggling through waist-deep snow toward his cabin, arms loaded with frozen wood from an outside pile. Hezekiah looked exhausted, desperate, burning through reserves at unsustainable rates. Day 19. The storm finally broke. Clear sky, deadly cold, absolute stillness. Winter 1848 proved brutal even by frontier standards. Temperatures remained below zero for weeks. Snow buried trap lines so deep that checking them became impossible. Trappers hunkered in their cabins, burning wood at rates that depleted carefully gathered supplies with alarming speed. Some abandoned their claims early, heading to settlements before starvation or cold killed them. Barnabas Cole had built his cabin 8 miles northeast of Ephraim's location, positioned near a creek that normally provided excellent beaver trapping. He was a capable frontiersman, experienced and careful, but experience meant nothing when circumstances aligned against survival. In late January, while splitting frozen wood outside his cabin, his axe glanced off a knot and buried itself in his left thigh. The wound was deep, cutting muscle and causing blood loss that left him weak and barely mobile. He managed to drag himself inside and bind the wound with strips torn from a blanket. The bleeding slowed, but did not stop completely. He could not walk without excruciating pain. He certainly could not venture outside to his woodpile, which stood 30 feet from his door. His fireplace held perhaps 6 hours of wood. After that, Cold would enter the cabin and finish what the axe had started. Barnabas understood his situation with absolute clarity. He could not reach his wood supply. He could not travel for help. His fire would die, and he would freeze. The nearest cabin was Ephraim's, 8 miles through deep snow. Impossible distance for a healthy man in good conditions. Suicidal for someone with a leg wound losing blood. But staying meant certain death. Leaving offered a chance, however small. Barnabas tied a tourniquet above the wound, wrapped himself in every piece of clothing he owned, and began crawling. He could not walk, so he crawled. He used a long pole to probe snow depth ahead of him, following the creek drainage where drifts were shallowest. 4 miles the first day. He built a fire using dead branches and bark, peeled from a fallen tree, spending the night shivering. Despite flames, he kept burning through sheer determination. 3 miles the second day. He was leaving a blood trail now, visible on the snow behind him. His wrapped wound had reopened. Weakness made even crawling difficult. He navigated by landmarks, using ridge lines and tree formations to maintain direction. 1 mile the third day. He could see smoke rising from Ephraim's cabin in the distance. He crawled toward it with fading strength, consciousness wavering, knowing he would either reach that door or die within sight of it. Ephraim found him collapsed 15 yards from the cabin that afternoon. He dragged Barnabas inside, treated the wound properly, and positioned him beside the sunken pit where heat radiated steadily from stones that had been absorbing warmth for months. The fire had been burning continuously since October. It was now late January. 93 days without adding wood would have been impossible, but Ephraim had added minimal fuel twice during extreme cold. The current load had been burning for 26 days untouched. Barnabas recovered slowly beside that impossible fire. And when he could finally speak coherently, his first question was how to build one himself. Ephraim spent a week nursing Barnabas back to functional health, feeding him venison stew heated over the pit's grate, and changing bandages twice daily until the wound showed no signs of infection. During long evening hours, Barnabas asked detailed questions about the pit's construction. Ephraim answered each one completely, sketching designs in charcoal on scraps of bark, explaining thermal mass principles as Alistair McBain had explained them to him. When Barnabas could walk with a crutch, Ephraim helped him return to his own cabin. They brought tools and spent 3 weeks excavating and lining a sunken pit in Barnabas's floor. The work was slower with 2 men, 1 injured, but the result replicated Ephraim's design faithfully. Rectangular pit, stone-lined walls, rounded corners, flush floor edges. They loaded it with 38 logs, using the nested stacking pattern Ephraim had developed. The fire they lit in early March burned for 23 days before requiring additional fuel. Word spread through the trapping community not through promotion, but through simple observation. Trappers visiting Ephraim's or Barnabas's cabins felt the steady warmth, saw the minimal wood consumption, understood the survival advantage. Hezekiah Tate built a sunken pit the following summer, though he never apologized for his mockery. Leif Magnusson, a Swedish trapper working territory near the Canadian border, constructed one and reported it burned for 27 days during a particularly cold November. The technique acquired various names. Some called them gauge pits after Ephraim. Others called them sunken fires or stone fires. The specific terminology mattered less than the adoption. By 1851, an estimated 40 trappers across Dakota and Montana territories had built variations of the design. Some added improvements. A few made modifications that reduced efficiency. But the core principle remained constant: deep excavation, stone lining, controlled combustion, thermal mass retention. Ephraim continued trapping until 1856, when declining beaver populations and changing markets made the profession unsustainable. He sold his claim to a homesteading family from Ohio and moved to a small settlement near Fort Pierre, where he worked as a carpenter and occasional guide. He married in 1858, fathered 2 children, and lived quietly without ever promoting his innovation or claiming special recognition. He died in December 1872 at age 53 from pneumonia that developed after helping a neighbor repair a roof in freezing rain. His obituary in the territorial newspaper mentioned his carpentry skills and community service. It said nothing about sunken fire pits or frontier engineering. To his family and neighbors, he was simply a reliable craftsman who had once been a trapper. But in the mountains and territories where winter could kill, his legacy persisted in stone-lined chambers built into cabin floors. Settlers moving west discovered abandoned trappers' cabins with mysterious rectangular pits and recognized superior heating design even without understanding the full engineering principles. Some pits remained functional decades after their builders had died or moved on. The stones still radiated heat. The rounded corners still prevented thermal cracking. The design still worked. Ephraim Gage never saw most of the pits built using his method. He never knew how many lives the design saved or how far the technique spread. His innovation was not carved in monuments or written in books. It was built into earth and stone, burning quietly through winter storms, keeping unknown people alive in country that forgave no mistakes. Engineering outlived the engineer, as it always does, speaking in warmth instead of words.